Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to a very exciting video, at least in my opinion. Today I'm going to be duping these shades from the ODEN'S Christmas Eve palette. Now, it was a choice, I think, from ODEN'S perspective to have these so limited edition and then subsequently decide never to bring them back again when there was like so much demand. But hey, I'm not a business owner. I guess, what do I know? Anyway, one of my first instincts when I saw this palette in person was that I really liked the curation of colors and the color story, but that likely these shades are probably going to be easy to dupe out with the shadows that I already have in my collection. That's kind of true and also not true. I think a lot of the shades in this palette, undertone wise, are kind of unique. But that being said, I think most of us, if you have like a, good amount of makeup, are gonna have shades that look similar enough. Likely, I mean, I was trying to get like close dupes just for like the purposes of like duping the shades, but I mean, at the end of the day, if something's slightly off, you're probably still gonna get a similar effect or similar look, Anyway, I don't have a huge single shadow collection, particularly mattes. I like almost have no matte single shadows, so all of these, or almost all of these, are from palettes. But I don't know, kind of just like if you were curious about any specific shade, or maybe you have one of these palettes, I don't know. Anyway, this is just how it's gonna have to be. I'm not like a single shadow person. I know like some people have like tons of single shadows, but that's not me. Anyway, maybe this will just inspire you to pull out what you already have in the first place. Okay, so starting out, obviously, with the first shade, I'll just swatch for my personal reference on my arm here, but also do close-ups of each shade in the comparison. The first shade is the shade Snowflake. So this is basically a like really sparkly, chunky, metallic silver. And I found that this actually was surprisingly hard to dupe. This was one of actually the harder shades, shockingly, because the undertone of this is like bright but also neutral. So traditional like silvers were almost like a little bit deeper than this, and the closest shade that I found in my collection was the shade Accentuate from the Blend Bunny All Done Up palette. Because it's a silver, but it has that same like neutrality to it almost, and it's a little bit lighter and not as deep. And I think, I mean, putting these on the eyes, it's gonna be pretty similar. And like texturally, this was also one of the closer ones, just because this shade is really sparkly, similar to the ODEN'S shade. So this is the first shade comparison. The next shade was another one that was actually quite difficult, the shade Ice Crystal, which is a matte gray, but it's quite a light gray. It's almost like an off-white gray, and it's like a little bit blue toned as well. So a lot of the grays I had were just too deep. I think I'm okay. Maybe I'll zoom in a little bit. I honestly never know. This is what happens when you don't have a viewfinder in your camera, I swear. But the closest that I could find was the shade Swipe Right from the BH Cosmetics Looking Like a Snack palette. This is not 100% accurate, as you can see, but all of the like traditional like kind of grays were just too deep. So this is probably the most off shade in this video, but it's like a cool toned, like almost gray. And I think if you mix this shade with like a more traditional, like almost bluey toned gray, you'd probably get a similar shade to Ice Crystal, but anyway. Or I found if you mixed a deeper gray with a white, you got a very similar shade to Ice Crystal, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to just have like one single shade. Anyway, the next shade is the shade Slivery Dream, which is another interesting one. It's kind of like a purpley taupey shade. It's like a taupe with purple kind of shimmer to it. It's really, really pretty, really sparkly. And I actually have two shades to dupe this. So the first shade I think is a little bit more similar in terms of the actual color, the shade Phosphenes from the Sydney Grace and Temptalia Radiant Reflection palette. Texturally, they're a little bit different because this Phosphenes shade is a little bit smoother, and the ODEN'S one is a little bit more sparkly, but I think they're very, very similar colors. But also the shade Energized from the Huda Beauty Rose Quartz palette is quite similar as well. I just felt like both of these shades kind of fit the vibe for the shade, so I wanted to mention both of them. Phosphenes is a little bit deeper, but maybe a little bit more accurate in terms of the purple tones that Slivery Dream has, but those are just two options. Again, the Huda Beauty shade isn't as sparkly. Next up, we have the shade Nightfall, which is a matte light blue. So let me just give it a little swatch here. This one was actually quite easy to dupe. The dupe that I have is the shade Neptune from the ODEN'S Solmane 2 palette. So this is same brand, and they're very similar. Neptune might be a little bit lighter, but I mean, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference truly on the eyes between those two. And it's like gonna be the same matte formula because they're both from ODEN'S. So that was a good dupe. If you have the Solmane 2 palette, keep that in mind. Next up, we have the shade Just Now, which is a green. Again, one that I thought was gonna be easier than it was because the undertone of this is a little bit different. It's a little bit brighter than a lot of like the grungier kind of matte greens that I was initially comparing it to. But I think that the shade Alive from the Blend Bunny Surge palette is actually quite similar to it. Because it has, again, that like not quite grungy matte green quality. It's a little bit brighter. Maybe not 100% accurate, but again, like I think on the eyes, they're gonna look pretty much the same. Next up, we have the shade Snow Light, which is a light gold. Again, very textured and very sparkly. This again is a little bit different from like a traditional gold just because it is quite light. It almost has like a white kind of like sheer base with like a gold, yellow gold shine. But I found that the shade Cetara from the BH Cosmetics Amore and Amalfi palette was quite similar as well. Again, not texturally the same. The ODEN'S one is a little bit more sparkly, but this is also kind of like a very, very light yellowy gold. I think shade-wise, they're very, very similar, basically exactly the same. I mean, it's still a really beautiful shade, just not the same texture. Next up, we have the shade Christmas Eve, which is a matte, like navy blue. So this is the shade Christmas Eve. And I found that a very similar shade was the shade, the shade Void from the Kaleidos and Angelica Nyqvist Club Nebula palette. So this is Void. That was like the most similar blue that I could find. I mean, a lot of navy blues are gonna pretty much perform exactly the same, but I was being a little bit picky. Next up, another blue shade is the shade Blue Ice. This is a metallic light blue. Again, quite sparkly, has like silver sparkle to it. The closest blue I could find was actually from the Beauty Bay Jade palette, the shade Crystal Clear, this light blue at the bottom here. So again, texturally a little bit different. They're looking quite different. I think I just need to build Blue Ice up a little bit more. Yeah, there you go. So texturally they're not the same. Again, the Odens I want is a little bit more sparkly, and those like silver sparkle in it make it shine a little bit later, but Crystal Clear is a light blue with, again, like a very similar kind of like icy shine. So I think they will give very similar effects. Oh, perfect. And this is half the palette, so I'll just switch to my other arm. Just switch sides. Okay, so the next shade up is the shade, oh my God. Okay, so the next shade up is the shade Feelting Time. And this was actually probably the easiest shade, I feel like, to dupe. I think we all have very similar shades to this. It's basically like an ambery, warm ambery copper metallic. There's not a ton of sparkle to this. It's like kind of just like a standard metallic shade. I found two that were very, very close. So the first is from the Juvia's Place, the Warrior palette, the shade Idia. Right here. Very, very similar. So this is the Juvia's Place shade. And also the shade Fuse from the Natasha Denona Metropolis palette is, again, very similar. So this is Fuse. And I mean, there were other ones that were also very, very similar. These are just the ones that I felt like were the closest. Next up, we have the shade Nowhere, which is a matte shade. It's like a light purple, like a gray purple. Again, this one was a little bit more difficult just because I think it's a little bit lighter than a lot of the cooler toned purples and a lot cooler. Like I had a lot of purples that were almost the same but had like more pink or were slightly more rosy, but this but I found a very close shade again in the Huda Beauty Rose Quartz palette, which was the shade Precious, which is this purple right here. So this is the shade Precious. So this is actually very, very similar, as you can see. I think maybe Nowhere is like the slightest bit more cool toned, but again, on the eyes, are you going to be able to tell the difference? Likely not. Next up, we have the shade Wonderful, which is a metallic light purple. Oops. I mean, this is getting a little bit hard pan, so it's a little bit harder to swatch. But that's it right here. So a little bit sheerer, very sparkly. ODEN'S eye shimmers definitely have a tendency to get hard pan. And I found a very similar shade in the Beauty Bay Love Notes palette, the shade Princess. Oh, whew. Oh my god, it's you know, harder than you think to hold palettes up like this. They're not technically meant for it. Anyway, this shade right here, Princess. This is also very sparkly. It's a little bit more opaque. The ODEN'S one is quite, like, has a sheerer base, but very similar shades, especially when you build up this ODEN'S shade. Tonally, they're very similar. But also, I found that the shade Meteor here from the ODEN'S Solmane 2 palette is again very similar. Yeah, so you can see those two actually are closer than the Beauty Bay shade. Honestly, they look almost identical, but another frame of reference if you have the Beauty Bay palette. But if you have the Solmane 2 palette, there's two shades right there from this palette that are very similar. Next up, we have the shade Softly, which is a like grungy green, yellowy matte shade. I found a lot of the, again, grungy greens I had. This had just like almost more, was more brown. It's a very like brown green. Okay, this is not swatching the best right now. Anyway. But the best shade that I found was actually from the Juvia's Place, the Nomad palette. And this green shade down here is very, very similar. Has that almost like yellowy brown quality that the shade Softly has. All right, moving on to the last row, we have the shade Le Mauve Tarte. Oh my god, literally these typos never fail to crack me up. And this is actually like a satin. It actually, and it does show up on the eyes, I will say. So honestly, it's not my favorite shade because it has quite a sheen to it. It's fine, it's workable. Definitely would have preferred a matte or a shimmer. Like for this color, I would prefer, like satin has its place, but I don't know, not in this color. And this is a very random comparison. I will say right at the gate, any yellow, any matte yellow will do. You know, I mean, if you want to have a satin yellow and you have one in your collection, then sure, but any matte yellow is pretty much going to do exactly the same effect that you would want that shade to do. Anyway, I found like the light, it's hard because the sheen of this kind of makes it look a little bit lighter than other yellows. Anyway, oddly enough, the shade Mischief from the ColourPop Yes Please palette was like a very good comparison shade. I don't know, I was just swatching a whole bunch of yellows and this one stood out to me as being very close, but again, can't emphasize this enough. Any matte yellow will do. I've swatched a lot of yellows, okay, to compare it. Next up, we have the most difficult shade in the palette to dupe, which is the multi-chrome, the shade Gorgeous. I don't think I have any exact comparisons to the shade. I don't think I have any shades that shift exactly all the same ways. This is a really, really beautiful shade. It's like indigo, purple, pink, teal, blue, gold. Like it's very shifty, super, super beautiful. But I feel like I have a good amount of shades that give similar effects. Kind of like an ethereal fairy that shift like blue, purple, green, you know, that kind of color shift. I have a lot of shades that do very like similar things, maybe not exact dupes, but similar vibes for sure. So the first shade that this reminded me of, and I'm pretty sure I talked about this in my 3 looks on palette video that I did with this, was the shade Stencil from Cleona. So let me get it out. This is Stencil. It's again like kind of like a blue, purple, pink shifting shade. But it doesn't have maybe like the warmth. Like this has like almost like a warm pink, almost orangey quality to it. This gorgeous shade does. So that's what Stencil is lacking, but otherwise it has like kind of a blue shift, a pink shift. I mean, it's also hard because, you know, looking at it from different angles, but it is like a very similar shade. It does have a little bit of warmth to it, maybe not quite exactly the same, but definitely like a similar vibe in terms of multi-chromes. And there is a number of shades from Terra Moons that I think, again, give similar vibes. Maybe you already have in your collection. So the first being Helix Nebula. So again, like a purpley blue, orangey, like warm pink. There's maybe not as much greeny teal to this, but again, like even face on, they look similar. Like they shift a lot of the same colors. Reign of Terra, again, is one that is similar to Stencil, maybe a little bit almost like more indigo than Gorgeous. A little bit more like purpley blue, but again, very similar vibes. Has like an orange shift in there as well. Chasing Comets is one that's maybe not like super exact, but again, similar vibes, like purple, blue, pinky, green kind of shade. And then also La Lune from Terra Moons is quite similar as well. Maybe a little bit more green, but again, purple, blue, green, pink kind of shade. And I do have one more. And then another shade that's very similar from Shine by Esty is the shade Oracle. So annoying. I'm running out of room. You'll see it in the up close swatches, but again, very similar shifts like pink, blue, green, teal, purple kind of shades. So these are all the multi-chromes in my collection that maybe aren't exactly the same, but have very similar color shifts and are all very beautiful. And I mean, are gonna give like a very similar effect on the eyes. And maybe you have one of these in your collection. You have a very similar multi-chrome to the multi-chrome in the palette, if you were curious about that one specific shade. And then maybe I'll just swatch the final shade on my hand. Oh no, there's two more shades. And then we have the shade Night Sky, which is a deep teal. Maybe I'll just do these on my hand. So this is the shade Night Sky, a matte dark teal. And the shade that I think is closest in tone, maybe not quite the same in terms of depth, but Interstellar from the Sydney Grace and Temptalia Quintessence palette, very similar tonally. So it might just be like a touch less saturated, but it almost looks like a slightly sheer version of Night Sky. But I think with building it up, they're very similar shades. Again though, I feel like you're probably gonna get a similar effect with any deep teal, but these were just like the most similar ones that I could find. And then finally we have the shade Blue. What is this? Blue Star. So this is a really dark, like almost black base shimmer, that is blue with like a purpley shift. Again, really sparkly, really pretty. And the closest shade I could find is this blue purple shimmer from the Kaleidos Futurism 3 ASTRO-PINK palette. I'm not 100% sure if this palette is still available. So the blue shine in this Kaleidos one isn't 100% the same. It's maybe like a slightly different blue. It's maybe like a hint of a more like almost tealy blue, whereas this is more of like a cooler toned blue, like a purplier blue. But I mean, again, very similar. Like the purples in here are the same. They have an almost identical, like slightly sheer, dark, kind of blackened base. Like texturally, they're basically the same. So this is like a very, very similar shade. I mean, the difference in blues is extremely nitpicky. And also one that you probably wouldn't notice anyway. Okay, so now I'm gonna do a little like side by side of my kind of palette. For the shades that I have multiple comparisons of, I'm just gonna pick one. I mean, they're all very similar anyway. Same with the multi-chrome, I'm gonna pick like whatever one I guess I think is like closest-ish, but obviously you'll have seen them all in close-ups and whatever. So okay, and so these are all the shades compared. I think I did a pretty good job. I mean, it was very particular when I was doing them like individually, but honestly, I think all of these shades are like very, very similar, which is a good reminder to myself and hopefully to you that, you know, even though things are new and shiny and exciting, a lot of the times we already have shades that are similar. I mean, I can justify the differences all day, all night, but at the same time, like, you can't dispute the facts, you know? You can't dispute the facts of these shades that are basically identical. Hopefully this was helpful, fun, or informative. I mean, helpful and informative are basically the same, but anyway. Or it helped you if you were feeling like a little bit of FOMO over not getting these palettes. Maybe you have one of these palettes or some of these palettes and you can create similar looks or shop your own stash for shades that are similar. I will be doing this with the Merry Christmas palette as well, so keep an eye out for that. It should be coming pretty soon. Let me know if you want me to like do this in the future for different palettes that are limited edition or whatever, because I'd be more than happy to. It was kind of fun to dig around through my palettes and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. I truly, truly appreciate it, and I would love to see you in my next one. Bye.